Hello, my beautiful biologist. There is no better time to learn biology than right now. Thank goodness it's time for another biology with Miss Judd. Have you hugged a tree lately? If not, you might want to give it some thought because we owe a lot to our plants out there. Us and all other organisms need energy to fuel all of our growth, development, and reproduction. And if you remember from previous lessons, the sun is the ultimate source of energy. Now, unfortunately, we can't just go outside to grow, reproduce, and develop. Instead, that sunlight has to be converted into chemical energy that then we can use. And converting that sunlight into chemical energy happens through the process of photosynthesis. And you know who goes through photosynthesis? That tree I was talking about before. We owe a lot to them, so you might want to thank them. Today, we're going to be talking about energy and that process to which light energy is converted into chemical energy in the form of glucose or a sugar. Ghost Mistrad here to interrupt. That was already a lot of information, and we need to make sure that we are writing this down. So let's have our folders out. Let's make sure we are ready for Unit 3, Lesson 2. Today, we're going to talk about energy first. Energy is the ability to do work. Without the ability to obtain and use energy, life would cease to exist. And for us to gain our energy, energy is stored in bonds of chemicals that we eat. So here we have this chemical is adenosine, ribose, and some phosphates. And in between each phosphate, there's a bond. And in those bonds, energy exists. So when a bond breaks, that energy is released out. Now we have two molecules that we eat in order to get energy. We have glucose, which is sugar, long-term storage with large amounts of energy. And then we have adenosine triphosphate. This is also known as ATP. Triphosphate meaning three phosphates. This is short-term storage and release of small amounts of energy for cells. This becomes ADP or diphosphate when a bond breaks, energy is released, and a phosphate is lost. So we start off with ATP, lots of high energy storage. The bond breaks, and energy is released out to do work. And then to store energy, all we have to do is add a phosphate back, and then a new bond is formed. And remember, energy exists in those bonds. So essentially, ATP, remember T for tri, 3, goes in between ATP and ADP. DP stands for di or 2. And this going back and forth between ATP and ADP, it reminds me of a rechargeable battery. So we have, when it's fully charged, all of the bonds, which is ATP. We release out energy, it releases a bond, so it becomes like a dead battery. And then we can recharge it by adding that phosphate back, and it goes around in this circle. When we talk about photosynthesis, we are going to talk about another energy carrier called NADPH. NADPH has this extra bond with that extra hydrogen. Remember, with more bonds, there is more energy. And then when that bond breaks and hydrogen's released out, it becomes like the dead battery, no energy. And then we can charge it back up by adding an extra hydrogen. So the same process. When we talk about photosynthesis today, we're going to be working through this process. We're going to be taking our previous knowledge of that the sunlight comes into a plant, water's pulled up the roots, and then it goes through a process to make food and release out oxygen. And we're going to actually figure out what's happening, the usage of ATP, NADPH in order to make our sugars or glucose. So let's start with the four big questions: who, what, when, where. Autotrophs, plants and plant-like protists, are the ones who go through this process. This process is converting energy from the sun into chemical energy stored in the bonds of carbohydrates, which is a sugar. When does this happen? During the day. when the sun is out. We are taking the chemical energy of the sun, so we need the sun. Where is this happening? This happens in the chloroplast. The chloroplast is one of our organelles that we spotlighted earlier. We are actually going to draw this simple version of a chloroplast in the box at the bottom of your page. What we have here, what makes up this organelle, is little pancakes that are green called a thylakoid. These thylakoids are in stacks. So we have stacks of pancakes or grana, which is a stack of thylakoid. The space around those thylakoids is called the stroma. And all of that is held inside a membrane to make it an organelle. Our chemical formula for what is going on is that we're taking in sunlight and carbon dioxide and water to make glucose and oxygen. Now, when we're talking about this chemical change of energy and material, we use a chemical formula. So we have sunlight plus 6 CO2 plus 6 H2O yields or creates C6H12O6. That C6H12O6 is the chemical formula for glucose. And then 6O2, 6 oxygen molecules. You will need to know both the words and the chemical formula, so make sure you have this written down. So let's start talking about this process. If we are going to be turning sunlight into chemical energy, we have to absorb that light somehow. Sunlight is very intense. Plants use something called a pigment, which is a light-absorbing molecule. The pigment that plants use is called chlorophyll. Chlorophyll takes in all of the sunlight range, absorbs the red and the blue, and reflects back green. So we see the color green because that's the one piece of light in the spectrum of light that is bounced back to our eyes. Every other wavelength is absorbed. Once the sunlight is absorbed, we go through the light-dependent reactions. This happens in that thylakoid. Remember that green pancake? Energy from the sun is captured by chlorophyll molecules and converted into chemical energy, ATP, NADPH. Essentially, the sunlight is so intense that we have to quickly turn it into short-term storage so that we can then store it in a long-term molecule. What goes in is water and sunlight. What comes out is ATP, NADPH, and our oxygen. Oxygen is just a byproduct. We essentially just steal the hydrogen off of water, and then that hydrogen gets attached to the NADPH, and oxygen just gets released back out. Plants don't need it. We need it, but plants don't. So what we're looking at here is the light-dependent reaction. We have sunlight and water coming in. We're charging up NADP plus and ADP. Once it's charged by that energy from the sun, it leaves ATP, NADPH, and oxygen is released out. That ATP and NADPH, those short-term storage molecules, need to go to the Calvin cycle to create glucose. So step 2 is the Calvin cycle, or light-independent reactions. This is happening in the stroma, in the space outside the thylakoid. The ATP and NADPH release their energy to turn 6 carbon dioxides into glucose. Glucose, if you remember, is C6H12O6. We need 6 carbons. So what comes in? ATP, NADPH, and carbon dioxide, CO2. What comes out? ADP, NADP plus, and glucose. So these charged molecules, ATP and NADPH, drop off their energy and go back to the light reactions to get recharged. To put it all together, it looks like this. Light, water coming into the light-dependent reaction, oxygen coming out. The charged up ATP, NADPH dropping off their energy at the Calvin cycle, going back to get recharged. That Calvin cycle stores that energy in glucose. And that is the more complex version of what we know that plants do, taking in sunlight and water to create oxygen and sugars. Before we go find regular Miss Judd, we need to pause and practice. You are going to take the word bank right here and use your notes, go back through, read over it to complete this diagram. So, for example, the pancakes are called thylakoids, and the process that happens in the thylakoids are the light reactions. The inner membrane is what holds the whole chloroplast together. Now, you do the rest on your own. Great work, you guys. I think it's time to go find regular Miss Judd. Whew, that was so much. Thank you, Ghost Miss Judd, for breaking that down for me. Once we have our notes and we have our practice and it's all handwritten, we are ready for class. So make sure you bring this folder and we're just going to dive right in. Good work, you guys. I'm so proud of you. Have a great day and make good choices.